Hi, and welcome to Civs 101, the show where historians discuss Sid Meier's Civilization series. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be looking at the Zulu, which is one of the original 14 Civs of the Civilization series. The Zulu have appeared in every game in the series, though in recent entries, they've arrived as post-release downloadable content. Throughout most of the Civilization series, the Zulu have been the sole representatives for the people of sub-Saharan Africa. Furthermore, throughout the entire series, the Zulu have been led by Shaka, whose presence in Civilization is as consistent as Gandhi for India and Montezuma for the Aztecs. To help me consider Civilization's depiction of Shaka and the Zulus, I've invited on Dr. T.J. Tallie. Dr. Tallie is an assistant professor of history at the University of San Diego. His area of expertise includes Southern African history, gender and sexuality, settler colonialism, and Zulu language and culture. His book, Queering Colonial Natal, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2019. TJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, well, I'm excited to have you. So, TJ, the roots of this episode began with a Twitter conversation in which you were complaining about Civilization 6, and in particular the Canadian leader, Wilfrid Laurier, who you can see here is one of my competitors in this playthrough of Shaka and the Zulu. And so I'm wondering, what is your experience with the Civilization series, and in a general way, what do you make of how this series presents the past?
Oh, that's so great. So thank you again. I'm so thrilled to be here. I obviously am a historian, and when the first Civilization game came out in 1981, I was 7, and I was one of those strange nerdy children that was immediately fascinated with basically what I called history Sim City, right? Which I think is not an unfair description of the game. So I'm someone who has grown up playing this game in every iteration and then became a historian, and specifically a Zulu historian, because Shaka has always been with me, right? And he was this initial figure that I first interacted with. The interesting thing for me is that, of course, history is dynamic and extraordinarily complex, but of course it gets flattened to make it, an enjoyable gaming experience, right? And there are lots of things I think that get lost to a certain extent when one flattens history to make it a sort of all part of the same sort of equal playable experience. And so for me as a historian, it's still a deeply enjoyable enterprise, but it is often almost separate from my love or interest in history as an academic pursuit, right? It is this sort of enjoyable way to imagine a different world, but also one in which the rules are so remarkably different than our own. I do love that it came from this initial conversation because I talk about my positionality as a Civilization player, right? I am a professor of African history. I am an African American. And also I often think about the ways in which certain presented. And it was very interesting to choose, for example, Wilfrid Laurier as the Prime Minister of Canada, who himself enacted some very particularly anti-Black legislation. He had some particularly sort of anti-Black sentiments in the early 1900s, not unlike most Canadian leaders, but one sort of surmising the idea that Canada was not a place for Black people. Right? So I did joke once as well that one of my fun things to do is often conquer Canada as Shaka's.
Well, as you can see here in my playthrough, we are not on the same page. We are unfriendly. He's got grievances against me, but unfortunately, as far as warfare, it's a little bit difficult because I'm up here kind of in the northeast of this continent, doing pretty well. Mm-hmm. But Canada's all the way down here in the south, and in between us are the Gauls. And so it's kind of like, well, I could try to fight the Canadians, but it would have to wait for better technology, especially with ships, in order to get down there.
Absolutely. And you can't immediately declare war on him, right?
Yes.
So always the Canada's magical peacetime defense shield it does make it a bit difficult. Also, you have the only other sort of active abdominal player between the two of you, right? Mm-hmm. So you Shaka and the leader of the Gauls, who I think both are sort of almost beefcakey designs, right? To sort of with sort of glistening shirtless men with shields and spears, looking very tribal for you.
Yes.
It's funny. One of my friends, we played a game where it was a series of all the shirtless men. And we called it Battle of the Himbos. So it was very fun to think about what does it mean when these shirtless men play against each other.
I love that. And then you've got some characters like Hammurabi. I mean, he's a bit of a mix between the two because, obviously he's shirted, but at the same time, you can tell he's built.
He's built.
There.
I mean, lifting those tablets has to be
Exactly. So let's turn to the subject for today's episode. And the leader of the Zulu Civ is Shaka. And he's appeared in every version of Civilization dating back to 1991. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the game's use of Shaka as a representative figure for the Zulu?
It's really fascinating, right? Because, of course, if we were to think of the Zulu, we could, and I'm sure we will, talking about the fact that the Zulus were the only African group chosen. And if you're going to pick sort of magical essentialist leader in the way that they did, right, for all of the leaders, Shaka is the most obvious choice. Shaka is the conventional founder of the Zulu Empire and sort of first central monarch. He is the one who, in 1816, when he succeeds his father, Senziga Kona, he's the one that sort of creates a unified Zulu polity and is, in many records, known as this sort of military innovator, which makes him sort of idea of presenting an innovative, militaristic civilization, right? And so when one thinks of sort of like the founding father, if there were such a thing, of the sort of Zulu nation as it's understood, Shaka Senziga Kona really does come to mind. So he's really the most fitting. But I find it's really interesting too, that in 1991, when Shaka's chosen, right, and the Zulus are chosen, this is only a few years, I think about 5 years after a very successful international TV series, right? So Shaka Zulu, which was produced by the apartheid government in South Africa, but had a widespread international audience. And it's also, in this iteration of Shaka, a very distinct resemblance to the way in which he was depicted in this 1980s biographical series, played by the legendary actor Henry Tallie. And so it's really interesting if you see side by sides of Henry Tallie, the actor, and this depiction of Shaka, they're very strikingly similar. So I love that it's a sort of historic moment that comes up there too.
Yeah, and I could say as a white guy growing up in North America in the 80s and 90s, to the extent that we had any education at all in elementary school about sub-Saharan Africa, it would be about Shaka and the Zulus. And I'm wondering if that has to do with this TV movie that came out.
It's because we're of a similar generation, and I think this was one of the hugely known sort of African figures, and in part because of the popularity of the series. Now, granted, the Zulu nation was itself a significant power, and during the apartheid era was a significant polity that had to be understood and negotiated with, even with the American state diplomatically. So it would have been someone that both through pop culture and geopolitically made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting if you're picking an initial 14 civilizations and truly thinking of the dearth of a historical imagination. But if you're going to pick one African civilization, sub-Saharan African one, it's not shocking they chose the Zulus, and it's certainly not surprising then that they chose Shaka as the leader, who is the quintessence of what one imagines a sort of Zulu leader and a sort of very sort of masculine warrior to be.
Yeah, and I think it fits in with at least the play style of the early Civilization games, in which, a big part of those were, trying to try your hand at world conquest. And, who better to do that with than a great military leader. And you could see the same thinking going into the chosen leaders for other civilizations. In the first few entries, you think about Frederick the Great, and Alexander the Great, and all these other, dead white guys with the great added to the name, you know. And so I think, you know, like you said, if you're going to pick one, it makes sense that it would be the Zulu, especially in that kind of late 80s, early 90s contest. And then if you were going to pick the Zulu, then Shaka would make the most sense in terms probably of gameplay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this idea of civilizations, it harkens back to a different era of historical study that's based around arbitrarily constructed groups of people, usually living in the ancient era. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the game's use of the term civilization, and what do you make of the game's Zulu Civ? That's
a great question. So I agree, right? As a historian, the term civilization is, I mean, if we're going to put a too fine a point on it, relatively problematic, right? It assumes a static, unified, unchanging sort of way of being. And I think nowhere was this more sort of that sort of tension of this is way back in, was it Civ 3? When you would have your leader, they only had one leader, but as the eras changed, they would change clothing and background, so they would look like other figures. So you had this sort of awkward moment of Queen Elizabeth looking like Boudica, and then looking like Queen Elizabeth, and then looking like Queen Victoria, and then looking like Margaret Thatcher, right? And then you had this moment, same for or Abraham Lincoln, then being in this sort of weird mythologized Stone Age version of the White House. So civilizations as a sort of universal unit don't make a lot of sense, right? They only make sense in this game when we hyper simplify. But then we have really interesting and problematic moments where, what does it mean to then think of the Australians as a civilization, but not Aboriginals, right? And to think of the Maori as a civilization, but then not New Zealand. And so what is this? When does one count? And then we have the moment of, say, the Cree versus Canada, right? And so these sort of putting them all as equally measurable, discrete or distinct units of measurement is strange. And it does harken back to a simplified time. And it is for the gameplay. One of the things that's fascinating is it makes for exciting gameplay to play the Zulus, right? They are militaristic. They are extraordinarily bonus powered now in these later versions with unique units. The Impi specifically being, Impi means war. It can also mean warrior in Zulu. Impi singular, Izimpi plural. And so taking the sort of Impi that was categorized by Shaka, especially with the development of the Ikwa, the new sort of short stabbing spear, and their use of Isamoto's Nkomo, known as the sort of the bull's horns or the buffalo's horns formation, like taking these units and making them sort of like profound military units is very exciting, right? But one qualm that I have is that it also runs the risk of reinscribing some of the more unfortunate 19th and 20th century racialized depictions of other peoples of the world, right? Not seeing any sub-Saharan Africans as particularly cerebral, right? We're not seeing, I would put him again initially, Shaka and the Zulus, which sounds like a strange music group, but Shaka and the Zulus in this sort of way with Montezuma and the Aztecs, right? These were Genghis Khan and the Mongols, right? These sorts of terrifying military ones that could wipe out your civilization, right? They were almost antithetical civilizations, right? And there's a distinct tracing of this back to, even rhetorically, back to the late 19th century, when the Zulus do defeat the British at the first battles of the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. Significantly, the British are defeated at the height of their military and global power by the Zulu nation under Cetshwayo's nephew, Shaga's nephew, Amanda Cetshwayo Kampande, and they're defeated at a battle called Isandlwana with the Impi. And so they have developed ever since this sort of mythology of being this extraordinarily powerful threat, like hyper-natural military force that can destroy civilizations. And I think part of that gets recaptured and redistributed in digital form in this game. It's not wrong to enjoy like the sort of power and the military development of the civilization, but it does make me want to question, what does it mean when we think that they can be reduced sort of to being this particularly military civilization. Sometimes I really enjoy playing the Zulus and then out of spite winning a space age victory.
Mm-hmm.
It's just to be, look what I can do. While I still conquer Canada because Wilfrid Laurier had a
You got to get Canada.
Yeah, they know what they were doing. I find often like I will always gun for Victoria and Wilfrid because they know what they did. But in general, I do think there's a sort of this easy assignation of them being just militarized. Now, granted, being a military culture is a big part of Zulu self-identity, right? Being part of this successful, powerful empire. And contemporary Zulus today would say this as well. But when that is sort of seen as the totality for this game, that can be worrisome, right?
Yes.
And simplifying.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And somebody with a PhD in British imperial history, the way in which the British tried to understand the Zulu was to put them in Western terms, these kind of over militarized terms, and it kind of blanks out the rest of their culture, right? It's like they can only be this militarized group, and that's the only way to explain how they could have defeated or held off the British for as long as they did. And that's, I think, done huge amount of detrimental power to kind of the historical legacy for the Zulu and for their culture.
Exactly. Well, and it's really fascinating, right? Because in the 19th century, they were seen as what were one of the several martial races in the British Empire. And this was a wide expanse. So the British would have considered Highland Scots. They would say, for example, the Sikhs. They would have considered the Zulu, a few others as these sort of martial races. And so these were ones that could be respected because they were not competitors, but they were seen as these hyper-natural military be modeled after, right? And defeating them by proxy then made Britain seem even more powerful. Mm-hmm. So they sort of reductive sort of rendering that's still there, right? And people would say, but it's our way of honoring them. And you're like, yes, but honoring them that also still tells an uncomfortable story, right? Yeah. And one that legacies of imperialism in it.
Yeah. So now we've entered the Renaissance, and Wilfrid Laurier is attempting to hold us off a bit by complimenting us, I think. So we're going to have to do something about this.
Yeah. No, Wilfrid. I see your little waistcoat. I see you.
So my last question is, you are a scholar, but you're also an experienced Civ player, and I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations for the developers of the Civilization series going forward, either with regard to Shaka and the Zulus, this new music group that we've come up with, or do you have any kind of general statements about Civilization going forward?
That is, I'm excited you asked, right? I think there's a few things. One, the gameplay itself, we're never going to fully escape the trap of Civilization, right? The trap of Civilization is that it has flattened a series of variables that are interchangeable. It's less Fordist than it used to be, right? Remember that it could be any civilization was the exact same, and it was just different colors. Now it's nice that they have sort of challenging or different gameplay, right? One of the things that also helps is having a significant array of sub-Saharan African choices. There was something particularly infuriating about having 11 or so European countries to choose from and being like, who am I going to be today? Am I going to be the Zulu or am I going to be Mali? Right? And so now having, Ethiopia or the Congo or Nubia, not perfect, but having a variety means that Shaka and the Zulus are less solely representative of sub-Saharan Africa, for starters, right? I think another thing would be the ability to possibly think about other leaders. Now, it's hard, though, because Shaka has become as iconic as, to a certain extent, Gandhi, and absolutely Montezuma. But what would it mean to think about playing against fate? It's been a very easy game to play a certain type of hyper. And yet, it's not as if there haven't been African scholars or Zulu scholars or Zulu diplomats, right? And so thinking about what might alternate tracks look like. Playing in the future might be interesting to sort of think about combining types or have different leadership or different control types. There are also no shortage of other figures actually historically to choose from. And as the game has done a good job of bringing lesser known figures more widely to the audience, that could be done too. There are a significant number of Zulu monarchs, including Letshwayo Kampande, the actual defeater of the British in 1879. Controversially, there is the 20th century leader under an independent, semi-independent Zulu state, still under the control of the apartheid South African government, known as a man still living named Mangosuthu Buthelezi. But these would be other figures, right? So I would think that playing the game in the future, the game could really include thinking about what does it mean to be Zulu other than just being a war machine? What does it mean to be Zulu other than AMV, right? One of the things they do this time that I think is so fascinating include Zulu music. And there is a full range of very well-known, well-established Zulu musical tradition, right? And so hearing guitars and Zulu choral arrangements, thinking about music like Isiklata Mia, which is best known to people in the West as some of the musical stylings of the group Ladysmith Black Mambazo, who collaborated with Paul Simon on the Graceland album in 1986. But thinking about what might sort of bringing up Zulu artistic conventions look like. I noticed that I don't hear any Zulu music or musicians as part of the great musician catalog, but Ladysmith Black Mambazo would be an excellent example, right? So rounding them out more would be great. Because again, we imagine a sort of universal civilization player who I think is often white, male, straight of a certain way. And yet, what would it mean to think there are Black people playing this game, right? What does it mean for us to see ourselves reflected? Or African people in general, right? The game, not just flattening universal characters so that you can almost cosplay them, right? It should be about thinking about the complexities of history while still being dynamic and fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. And, I think just trying to imagine the developer's perspective, it seemed like they've really leaned in with Civilization 6 into the leaders. And in fact,
Yes.
when you're choosing a Civ, you choose it by the leader's name. You don't choose it by the Civ that they represent, which I think is an interesting turn. And I think it kind of plays into that idea that you have of, cosplaying as this person, as this leader. But, I think you're right. It's an interesting idea, if you are this traditional kind of assumed game player. But what if you don't come from one of those assumed backgrounds, right? What does it mean? Is it as interesting? Is it as compelling? And I think, you bring up some good points as to ways that could change going forward.
Yeah, it's still, as always, I mean, I cannot believe that it has been 30 years since I first played this, right?
I know.
And right on my family's big boxy computer, they were like, get off the computer. I was like, but I want to play. And I'm a professor that is like, oh, is this research if I do this? And yet it still compels us, right? We do want to be involved in sort of a grand narrative. We want to be involved in this history. Although you and I, as we both know, history is not just a grand narrative. It's what is attractive, but it's not just great leaders, right? And it's not just powerful civilizations. One of the things that's really difficult about Civ is that we don't actually see everyday people, right? Mm-hmm. It's harder to gamify that. It also means that we then flatten some particularly horrifying aspects of history, right? The idea, again, for me as a Black American player, picking triangle trade as one of my civics options is always uncomfortable, right? Like, and especially when I'm playing triangle trade on like a real Earth map, I happen to be on North America, and then I can make a cotton plantation. There's an actual weird psychological moment that happens when you're like, no. And so that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done, but it needs to be done perhaps with more care. And it's not the same thing as like having a merchant marine, right? Like those are, it seems almost flippant, right? To have colonialism just simply as, or the ability to declare colonial war, right? And I think that, again, it presumes a universal player who has not experienced the negative repercussions of these things. And so these are interesting things to play rather than lived realities.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, that does it for this episode of Civs 101. TJ, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh my God, I had a blast. I can't wait to go home and play more of this.
All right. Until next time, viewer, goodbye.